right, people are joining. Hi, folks. We're just giving everyone another minute or so to join in before we get started.
So, all right, Nick, I'm going to kind of jump in here and let's get started. My computer says it's 1 o'clock. So I just saw a good morning in the chat from UCLA, Deanna Evans. Welcome, Deanna. So, hey, everyone, my name is Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. Welcome to this podcast. Before we get started, I want to introduce my colleague, Nick, who will be kind of like helping facilitate this, answering questions and so forth. Many of you have probably met or already chatted with Nick on some level. So I'm introducing Nick. I also wanted to ask if you could go in the chat function. You see on the bottom of the Zoom screen in the chat, just go in and say hello. Let us know where you're from. We could all get to kind of know. Here, there's someone that's Marianne from Florida. Great. Hey, Marianne. Good afternoon from Kansas City, Notre Dame, Portland, Oregon. Gary, hey, Frank Hamilton. Hey, Frank, welcome back. Frank is a Icehouse facilitator. Joe Mahoney, my buddy Joe. Joe Mahoney's on this call. I got to just tell you a quick backstory. In the summer of 2006, I took the NIFTY, National Foundation for Teaching Entrepreneurship course in Washington, D.C., and that's where I met Joe. He was my facilitator, and we've been friends ever since for 14 years. Let's see, I'm gonna stop talking here. San Antonio, Texas, North Carolina, Roanoke. Boy, I can't, they're coming in faster than I can read them here. Becky from Jackson, Kentucky. Steve Kramer, UNC Greensboro. Hey, Steve. Prentice, all right, Prentice Earl. All right, so happy to have you here, Prentice. Prentice is a good friend of mine. We worked together at the Kauffman Foundation back in 2000, I don't know, 10, 12, 15, 16, 4 or 5 years. Paul from South Carolina. Okay, Durban, South Africa. Susanna, welcome. Paul Baines from Cape Town. Julie from Huntington, West Virginia. Erie, Pennsylvania. All right, fabulous. I'll stop with all that now. So we're going to try something else on this webinar. We're going to launch a poll. So Nick's going to launch a poll. One quick question just about your interest in entrepreneurial mindset education. So we're just asking, like, what is your area of interest? If you could just sort of click on and let us know, like, which domain best speaks to you. This is fascinating, Nick. I can see, you know, it's real time happening. Almost everyone is coming from education. Some are aspiring entrepreneurs. That's awesome. Coaches, economics, small business, some workforce. But 2/3 of folks so far are from education. So that's really helpful to know.
Absolutely.
So thank you all for doing that. I'm going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my screen. And before I do that, the one thing I wanted to say is there's 3 key concepts here that we're going to talk about. And I'm going to pause after each for Q&A. So you can put your questions in the Q&A. You can post questions in the chat. We'll address them at the pauses in between each of these core concepts. Hope that makes sense. Sharing my screen. Let me get to, okay. Nick, I'm going to make the poll go away. It's right in the middle of my, Do we need to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead and X out of it. That's fine.
Okay, I'll just close out the poll. Okay, great. So the big idea here is online entrepreneurial mindset education. And, you know, in all seriousness, what I want to demonstrate on this webinar is the ways in which entrepreneurial mindset education, in fact, optimizes engagement and unleashes potential. It's not just like a, you know, a cute little tagline we came up with, but it's grounded in a lot of the research that we've done and the work that we've done in this domain of entrepreneurial mindset education. So let me get started here. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, my name's Gary. I said this before. I'm Gary Schoeniger. I'm the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. Our focus is on entrepreneurial mindset education. And we offer professional development, certification training, and courseware, all in the realm of entrepreneurial mindset. And we serve academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, individuals, corporations, government entities all over the world. That's what we do. So many of you may know us as the creators of the Icehouse entrepreneurship programs. I'm the co-author of the book, Who Owns the Icehouse? I'll tell you a little bit about that at the very end. But we're also the creators of the Icehouse entrepreneurship program. So I wanted to start this. So this is something kind of new. So I wrote this out because I don't have it committed to memory. I want to sort of like start with this journey that I've been on for more than 2 decades. And so here's what I wrote. After more than 2 decades of interviewing entrepreneurs and studying the research in cognitive, behavioral, and social psychology, a new theory has emerged. One that not only reveals the methods and the processes that enable entrepreneurs to recognize, evaluate, and actualize opportunities, but also explains the subtle underlying causes, both within the person and the situation, that drive entrepreneurial behavior. So I'm calling this entrepreneurial mindset theory, and bear with me, it's a working theory. I don't have it all figured out. So my friends like Frank Hamilton, the academics that are on the call, can cut me a little bit of slack. Okay. So EMT, entrepreneurial mindset theory, posits that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. And that while not everyone may want to start a business, we are all born with an inherent proclivity to be autonomous, to be innovative, and to be entrepreneurial. That is, we all have an innate desire to solve problems, to be engaged in work that matters, to have control over our day-to-day lives, and to see our efforts lead to a pathway towards a more meaningful and prosperous life. That's a universal condition. So EMT assumes that the entrepreneurial spirit is the human spirit. And it's not just in some of us, it resides within us all. And that the development of entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills is largely dependent upon social, environmental, and situational factors rather than dispositional traits. Moreover, EMT postulates that the cultivation of these inherent tendencies is necessary, not only to adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing world, but also for economic prosperity and for psychological well-being. So thanks for hanging in there with me while I'm reading that statement, but it really encapsulates what I've discovered. I set on this journey, nearly 30 years ago to deconstruct the mindset of an entrepreneur in the hope that this could be useful to other humans, I'm interested in the underdog entrepreneurs. Like, I wanted to understand how people who have no particular advantage in life manage to alter their place in the socioeconomic structure. How do they do that? And more importantly, why, right? So I originally started on this journey. If I could somehow deconstruct the mindset of these underdog entrepreneurs, it could be useful to other humans. And this is taking me on this fantastic, amazing journey this statement that I just read, the entrepreneurial mindset theory, is sort of the culmination of something much, much broader that I stumbled into, which is what I'm excited to share with you. So there's three critical concepts that I promise that we're going to talk about. I'm going to start by redefining entrepreneurship in a way that anyone can embrace and kind of broaden the conversation there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time defining what a mindset is and how it functions. And then I'm going to talk about these 5 constructs of an entrepreneurial mindset that we tend to focus on. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about entrepreneurial learning and you know, how these things can be done online. We've like observed how entrepreneurs learn naturally and what that looks like in a more formal learning process. So I want to start by redefining entrepreneurship. I mean, that's really, I think, the place that we're stuck, right? And you know, here we are in May, what is it, May 14th, 2020. You know, it's abundantly clear that the world has changed in ways that now require everyone to think like an entrepreneur. And I'm emphasizing that word "think" to emphasize the idea that you don't need to start a business to be entrepreneurial, right? You can be entrepreneurial in whatever domain that you choose. So the challenge lies in that our ability to embrace entrepreneurship is limited the ways in which we define it, and that word means so many different things to so many different people that it causes us to get stuck, and we don't recognize it as a solution, as the broader solution to some of our economic and psychological well-being. So, okay, hold on one second. Something's going on with my computer here. Give me 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I got distracted there for a second. You know, this word means so many different things to so many different people. You know, some hear the word entrepreneur and they think of the Silicon Valley whiz kids. Some think of entrepreneurs as Main Street small business owner. Some people think of the word, you know, it's negatively, like an entrepreneur, people are someone who just exploits others for their own gain. So we got to start by defining it in a way that everyone can embrace it. And each of those images of the entrepreneur, you know, is rooted in you know, reality. But when we look at the mindset and the methods and the motivation of the everyday entrepreneur, it doesn't really line up all that well. And that's really what I wanted to get into a little bit here. So the best way I've found to explain entrepreneurship is through this concept called transformation theory. It was developed by a guy named Dr. George Land to explain the nature of change within any living system. It's really, really helpful for sort of, well, what I want to say, it's really helpful for sort of separating entrepreneurial behavior from business activity or from managerial activity. So here's how it works, right? What Land is saying, there are 3 phases of change. There's a discovery phase, there's a growth phase, and there's an obsolescence phase, or it could be a reinvention phase, depending on the circumstances, right? And what Land is saying is these 3 phases, discovery, growth, and obsolescence, are inescapable facts. And what he's saying is the trick is that each phase requires separate rules for survival. And the trick is to understand which phase you are in so that you know which rules to apply. because when we get wrapped around the axle, when we try to apply the rules for survival in discovery phase for the rules for survival in the growth phase, or vice versa, right? That's what we call maladaptive, right? The inability to sort of recognize that the circumstances are different, they require different attitudes and skills. So the orange dots are represented, they represent something that Land calls breakpoints, and they're just representative of the moment in time when the rules for survival change. And keep in mind, it's not like a moment, like a day, like a, you know, it's just like the transition phase is probably a better way to put it. So simply put, in the discovery phase, we learn how to survive. And once we figure that out, then we go into the survive mode where we get better and better at whatever it is we're doing so that we can grow. And then at some point, the growth starts to slow. We're either fading into retirement or the world has changed and we need to reinvent ourselves, right? That's really it. Those are the three phases. The point I want to really drill into here for a minute or two is that what does the discovery phase look like from an entrepreneurial perspective, right? And it's really distinct from the discovery process that most of us have been through, which is through a formal education process, right? Where the path is clear, there's guided pathways, there's a known curriculum, there are like career pathways, there are certain assumptions that we're going to work in a highly stable, centralized, controlled environment, and so it's a little bit different than entrepreneurial discovery. So I think of it like this. I think this is the most useful way to think about entrepreneurial discovery. We're searching for the intersection of three basic spheres. This is like a Venn diagram, right? Our own natural interests, our own natural abilities, the things we're capable of becoming good at, right? So the intersection of these two things, our interests and our abilities, if you were to draw a circle around those two things, I would say then you have authenticity. And that's really important because, you know, as Naval Ravikant said, like you escape competition through authenticity. And when you can find the intersection of your natural interests and your natural abilities, it's easy to get really, really good at something, right? And then the third sphere is to find that intersection of like where your interests and abilities intersect with the needs of other humans, right? Well, school teaches us, like formal education historically has taught us how to work for an employer. And there's some underlying assumptions that are deeply embedded in the culture of formal education that, you know, these assumptions are buried within. But the idea is in the entrepreneurial discovery, the first break point is reached when we find that intersection. We're solving a problem that we care about, that we have an interest in, and it solves a problem for other people. That's really what the break point is. So I've expanded that discovery column to be able to tease it out a little bit here, right? So here the discovery begins, right? And that could begin at any moment. It could begin right now on this webinar. Whatever, the discovery begins. And the line is going down because you're kind of wandering off in the dark, right? And so one of the points that I want to, you know, it's really important to understand is the context matters. And I didn't really emphasize this strongly enough earlier, but I alluded to it in the entrepreneurial mindset theory. So often we tend to see the entrepreneur, we attribute entrepreneurial behavior to individual traits. It's something they're born with. And this causes us to make these gross errors in judgment about how to cultivate entrepreneurship, right? The psychologists call this a fundamental attribution error, which essentially means we overemphasize the importance of a person's dispositional traits, and we tend to underemphasize or ignore the situational factors that influence their behavior, right? So one of those factors is the discovery is characterized by lots of ambiguity and uncertainty, right? We don't really know what's happening. We're trying things that are new or never been done before. At least they're new to us, right? And there's not a formal learning path. There's not a like an assurance of an outcome. See, when you're going through like formal education, there's more so, although this is less true now, but there's more of like an assurance of an outcome. You get an engineering degree at Dartmouth, you know, you're going to have a good job. There's an assurance of an outcome. In the entrepreneurial discovery, much less so. There's also in a very resource constrained environment, right? We don't have access to resources. So the question is, how do we survive in a highly ambiguous, resource constrained situation? And I want to say this, I want to tell you that even if you do have resources, you should act as if you don't. And that's an important point. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but you can ask a question, I'll dig into it later. But the ambiguity and the resource constraints are actually the optimal circumstances within which to develop entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, right? Lots of ambiguity and uncertainty, limited resources. And I cannot overemphasize, those are the conditions. Those are some of the conditions. I'll talk about more of them later, but those are like optimal conditions within which to cultivate entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills, right? So, and here you go, the connection is found. As from an entrepreneurial perspective, from a traditional perspective, the connection is found when you graduate and you get your first real job, right? You graduate from college, you got your first real job, you can support yourself, hopefully, and you know, now you're gonna go get better and better at that job and have a career, fine. Entrepreneurial perspective, the connection is found when you have evidence of usefulness. So we're not even really talking about business, we're just talking about finding ways to make ourselves useful to other humans. And I cannot overemphasize this. Like, we have to break entrepreneurship down to what Elon Musk calls his first principles. Like, at its very essence, that's what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how to make ourselves useful to other humans. That's it, right? The connection is found when we figure out something that's useful. Now, in most cases, that evidence could be currency. Someone's paying you for something you've created or written or produced or whatever. But it doesn't have to be currency. You know, you can be an educator and you've written a blog for other educators and you have 10,000 subscribers. That's evidence that you've created something useful, right? The point here is that it's an evidence-based discovery process. It's not gambling, it's not fortune telling, it's a scientific method. So how do you survive in those circumstances, right? And I'm going to be quick about this, but you need problem finding skills, and no one is talking about this, right? This requires empathy and curiosity, observation and inquiry. If you want to dig deeper into it, read Clayton Christensen's book called Competing Against Luck. It's really about teasing out unarticulated needs, teasing out the social and emotional as well as the functional dimension of human needs, right? We have to start paying attention to what other people want and need. Then we need to develop problem finding skills, right? This takes creativity and innovation. It also takes critical thinking, experimentation and adaptation, collaboration, teamwork, networking, communication, resourcefulness, right? And lastly, it takes like self-direction and self-regulation. We need an internal locus of control. We can't keep going to like a professor or a teacher or a parent to tell us where the correct answers are, right? We need to learn to tolerate ambiguity. And you know, some of you may have heard me say this before. I would forever lecture my adult children. You know, either you figure out how to tolerate ambiguity, or you will forever be at the mercy of someone who has. And that's really a very powerful yet subtle psychological idea there. Have to figure out how to learn on our own, which means unlearning and relearning, which is a tricky thing, which requires self-awareness, and it also requires resilience, right? So this is very broad. We don't have time to I could delve into each one of these points, but these are basically entrepreneurial discovery skills, right? Once you find the useful thing, then you start to replicate the useful thing so it can grow, right? That's kind of the world most of us live in, where we participate in what I would call routinized value creation. We're part of a bigger system. We're only doing one small part of the process within a larger system. The system is organized around growth. It's about efficiency, improvement. It's a process driven. It's very managerial, right? And then in a corporation or an organization, you know, when the growth starts to slow, that's when we've got to start, you know, large scale initiatives to reinvent the organization, right? And that's kind of like what we learn in business school, right? How to help large established organizations diversify or reinvent themselves. Bifurcate, I think, is the term that George Land uses. Excuse me. So that's just another sort of a brief overview. The problems happen when we try to teach this sort of MBA business thinking. We try to take those column 3 MBA skills and we try to apply it to entrepreneurship, and it doesn't work because we fail to recognize the contextual differences. And let me just get into that briefly. So in a large established organization, when you want to reinvent yourself, these are big, bold initiatives. The beast is very large now, right? You need to go big game hunting. You can't survive like, you know, hunting mice, right? And so these are large scale initiatives that require in-depth research and very careful planning. The point here is that the cost of failure here is very, very high. The second point is that the opportunity is visible. It's quantifiable. It's often, you know, an acquisition of another company, but the market is quantifiable. It's known, right? And those are two important factors for large scale reinvention. But they're different from entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills for the opposite reason, right? So what the underdog entrepreneur does is they survive by reducing the cost of failure through a process that we call micro-experimentation, right? So imagine if you and one of your buddies, you're just like, we're hunter-gatherers, you know, 150,000 years ago, when you get separated from your tribe, you're lost in unfamiliar territory, you're really, really hungry. You walk up to a bush full of bright red berries that you've never seen before. You don't start eating all the berries because the cost of failure is very high. You take one berry off the branch and you rub it on your lips or on your tongue, and you go away for a little while and see if you get sick or your face swells up, right? That's essentially what the underdog entrepreneurs do. They learn through micro-experimenting. They reduce the cost of failure, which enables them to survive longer and longer and longer, right? The other aspect of the entrepreneurial discovery process is that the opportunities they're pursuing are often latent. There's a really important subpoint here. Not only is the opportunity they're pursuing often latent, meaning it's present, but it's not visible, but their own innate potential is latent, right? they don't even know what they're capable of at the beginning. So not only is the opportunity they're pursuing latent, but their own individual ability is not known to them either. Long story short, in large organizations, the cost of failure is high, the opportunity is visible. That's where you use in-depth planning and research and so on and so forth. That doesn't work for entrepreneurship, which is more about experimentation and adaptation. So that's really all I'm going to say about that for now. But I just want to sort of, end by redefining entrepreneurship as an opportunity discovery process, right? It's a really straightforward definition. Doesn't require you to want to start a business. I mean, is there anyone on this call that does not want to discover a new opportunity, right? Not everyone wants to start a business, but we're all hungry for opportunities. We're all looking for growth. I mean, it's a natural, innate tendency, right? The point here is that entrepreneurial discovery requires discovery skills. And these are skills that anyone can learn to develop. They're simply skills that our systems of education have historically overlooked, undervalued, or ignored. And if you look at them again, you'll see that entrepreneurial skills are the 21st century skills, that educators and employers, that these are the skills that the world now demands, right? They're discovery skills. So I'm going to pause there. I think we're okay on time. Just want to pause to see what questions you have around this redefinition of entrepreneurship as an opportunity discovery process.
Just giving folks a second here to type in some questions. We had some nice comments coming in about the general foundation of entrepreneurial mindset theory, and a couple points that I know you're going to be touching on when you get to mindset in a few minutes here. So definitely excited to hear about that. Oh, here's a question. How long should one allow for the discovery process?
Oh boy, that's a good question. It's a really interesting question. So I would say as long as it takes. But there's so many situational factors, like how unhappy are you? How desperate are you? How satisfied are you, right? That's one set of situational questions. But another question is like, if you learn how to micro experiment, you can go on indefinitely until you find that intersection of your own interests and abilities and the needs of others, right? It's really, how much ambiguity can you endure, right? But another way to answer the question is, like, it's definitely non-linear, right? And we're so I would say inured to like linearity and stability and consistency and predictability. Like that's the world we kind of came up in, and that's all gone now. But the underlying assumptions are still there, and that's where we get in trouble, right? It's a fantastic question. Thank you.
Absolutely. Your friend Joe Mahoney is asking, what process do you recommend to teach these discovery skills to young people?
Joe, there's this thing called the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. All joking aside, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. We developed a canvas that's loosely based on Alexander Osterwalder's business model canvas, but we simplified it. We took the business vernacular out of it. I don't like to use business terms. I mean, they're humans. They're not customers or clients or segments. They're like human beings. We're trying to figure out how to make ourselves useful to humans. And we should be searching, in the general vicinity of our own natural interests. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit, Joe, but it's a really good question. our tools and our curriculum are being used now in middle schools. It's kind of exciting to see how far down this is getting pushed into the public education system. Be happy to talk to you more about that, Joe, offline.
Just a couple more questions. One is Joe saying LOL, which is yes, thank you, Joe, for all jokes aside. Teresa Sims is asking, how do you help individuals, adult students discover their interests, especially when exposure is limited? I think you'll be kind of touching on that more in a little bit as well, but if you want to have any quick thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, they're of course, like we're in constraints. You know, you can't go out of the building and like walk up and talk to strangers. So that discovery is a little bit harder, but it can be done. I mean, there are plenty of examples of people that launch businesses without ever leaving the comfort of their home. It's going to force us to adapt technology. I mean, let's not forget, you know, the internet is connecting us with several billion people at any given time. We just have to kind of change the way we think about it. And I'm seeing so much evidence that COVID is kind of forcing us how to do that.
Absolutely. One more question for this section, and then I'll bring any others that are related to this up next time, just so we can keep things moving. But what role does the entrepreneurial ecosystem play in a community to facilitate this discovery process?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and thank you for that question. I don't know how to answer that because I think, you know, I don't want to offend people that are ecosystem builders, because ecosystem building is really, really important. But sometimes, like we you know, I'm going to answer it like a little more snarkily, like it from Elon Musk said something about like, you don't need an ecosystem, you need customers. The big missing piece, and in all seriousness, like here's how I'm going to answer the question. The most important thing that's necessary in the ecosystem, in my view, is not venture capital. I mean, when somebody says you need venture capital for the ecosystem, to me, that's someone that sounds like they're trying to replicate Silicon Valley. Like, forget about it, right? That's like the venture-backed startup is a tiny fraction of a single % of all new startups. What we need that's missing from the discussion about the ecosystem is relatable models, socially relatable examples, right? That's how you get people to adopt new behavior. So we have to keep putting forth the examples of the everyday entrepreneurs and stop glorifying the venture-backed Silicon Valley billionaires, right? You know, showing people like Mark Zuckerberg or Henry Ford or Elon Musk or whomever is probably doing more to discourage than it is to encourage the entrepreneurial behavior. So what's needed in the ecosystem are the examples of the everyday entrepreneurs. And that gives me a segue to talk about a project that we're launching called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Project that we're launching. We're now starting to interview entrepreneurs all around the world, underdogs, making the interviews available for free via a podcast. Even the videos will become available. So I've already talked to Joe about this, Joe Mahoney, my friend in Bermuda. But if any of you know of underdogs, please connect us to them. The world needs the wisdom and the knowledge of the underdog entrepreneurs now more than ever. So thank you for the question.
All set to keep moving. I'll bring up any that come in as we go.
Thank you, Nick. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a mindset now, and a lot of people use this word mindset and without really understanding what it means. And I've scoured the psychological literature. It's not really a clinical term, and so I'm going to put some definition around it, my own. You know, Carol Dweck, who many of you are familiar with, who wrote the book called Mindset: A New Psychology for Success. She defines it simply as a way of thinking, which is not adequate for our purposes. So here's a short definition. It's the underlying beliefs and tacit assumptions that influence our decisions. The key word here is underlying. They're the beliefs that lie beneath our conscious awareness, right? That's the key to a mindset. Well, here's how it works, right? And it took me a long time to be able to kind of put this together. So Edgar Schein is a professor emeritus at MIT who studied culture, organizational culture his whole life. And he's got the classic definition of culture, which I'm sharing here. And here's why I'm using that. Because culture really is a collective mindset, right? So that's the way to think about it. So a culture is, he defines as a pattern of shared basic assumptions learned by a group as it solved its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems, right? And I think this is the big challenge with education. We're, unwittingly bringing the younger generation into the logic of the present without recognizing that the logic of the present isn't working. It was once considered valid, but it may no longer be valid. Nevertheless, so a mindset is a pattern of basic assumptions learned by an individual as he or she solved problems of external adaptation or internal integration that worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore assumed to be the correct way to perceive, think, and feel, right, in relation to those problems. There's a lot in there to unpack, and we'll send you all the slides. I'm going to get into it a little deeper here. So the culture shapes our mindset, and our mindset shapes the culture. In sociology, they would call this agency versus structure, right? But there's a circular relationship, right? Our mind, we have our own free will, but we're influenced by the culture. So here's some key things to remember of thinking about a mindset, right? It's mostly unconsciously acquired through social influence and our individual construal, which is our subjective interpretation of events. It's not actual events. It's our construal of events. Now, here's the funny thing about the way our brain works. Our brains can't really decipher easily between a belief, an assumption, and a fact, right? So we interpret a situation in a certain way, it lodges in our brain as a fact when all it was is our interpretation, right? So as I've already said, mindset resides beneath our conscious awareness. The purpose of a mindset is very straightforward. Our brains need to reduce the cognitive load. So it's constantly seeking to automate as much as possible in order to reduce the cognitive load, right? So if you ask a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, what's 3 times 4, you'll see exploratory thinking. You'll see them counting on their fingers, figuring it all out, right? That's exploratory thinking. If you ask an adult what's 3 times 4, they're going to tell you 12, right? That's exploitative thinking. They're exploiting prior knowledge, right? And it just happens like that. It's a simple example. Our brains need to reduce the cognitive load. So it tries to create habits and rule structures and mental models that we can draw on instantly to navigate life. Without it, we couldn't function. If we had to figure out every day, like, what's a pair of shoes, what's a light switch, we couldn't function, right? So it's necessary. But I think the important thing to understand here is that our brains are seeking to automate everything it possibly can. And if the beliefs and assumptions and mental models that we automate are ineffective or out of date, we get in trouble. The mindset operates pretty much effortlessly without our awareness, right? And the tricky thing is that our mindset is subject to all manner of predictable errors of judgment that, you know, psychologists would call cognitive biases, right? That can fool us. As Richard Feynman said, like, the first trick is not to fool yourself. And you're the easiest person to fool, right? And so what happens is that our mindset draws from the past to navigate the future. And our brains tend to disconfirm or deny evidence that does not fit with our preconceived beliefs, right? So what does this mean? It means that a mindset in motion tends to stay in motion, right? It becomes this self-perpetuating mechanism. And lastly, mindset influences all aspects of our life. It influences our motivation, it influences our cognitive abilities, our emotions, and the choices we make. And most of that happens without our conscious awareness, right? I mean, this should keep you all up at night. I think that it was Carl Jung who said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So here's how it works, excuse me. Let's use the tried and true iceberg analogy. On the surface is what you can see and touch, visible artifacts and observable behavior. Just beneath the surface, we find our explicit knowledge and our espoused values. This is what we know and what we say that we value, right? At the base of the iceberg lies our implicit knowledge, deeply held values, taken for granted beliefs, and tacit assumptions, right? That is where the mindset resides. And the point here is that what shows up on the surface is less likely to be the result of your explicit knowledge and espoused values, and more likely to be the result of these deeply held beliefs, taken for granted assumptions, right? That's kind of how a mindset works. If you know, one of the examples I'm fond of using is, like, let's say you know someone who complains a lot, right? So the complaining is the observable behavior. It's what shows up on the surface. If you ask them, like, what they're complaining about, they're going to give you some plausible problem why they're complaining, right? But in the case of the chronic complainer, what they're probably not aware of is their behavior is not the result of their boss or their wife or their kids or their husband or whatever. Their behavior is the result of a deeply held sense of helplessness or learned helplessness or powerlessness that they're not aware of, right? We don't walk around saying, hi, my name's Gary, I'm powerless, right? These are deeply held beliefs that influence our behavior. And another way to think about this is that a mindset is a belief system, and it's perfectly designed to get the outcomes that it's getting. And then that's a way to think about it. In other words, if you don't like what's showing up on the surface, best place to start is start to look at your deeply held beliefs. Now, this begs the question, how do we examine beliefs that we don't even know that we have, right? That's the tricky part. How do you find a tumor that doesn't show up on an fMRI or an X-ray or any other kind of scan, right? So you do that by micro-experimenting, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's really the basis here. So, you know, I spent the last 10 years or so traveling around the world interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs, hundreds of these underdogs. And I've come to believe that there's this sort of fundamental assumption on behalf of the entrepreneur that distinguishes the entrepreneur from, let's say, the non-entrepreneur. And that is that it's my responsibility to figure out how to make myself useful to others. And that by doing so, I can empower myself. I mean, I think That's a core underlying assumption that from which all other entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills arise. Now, there's 5 aspects of an entrepreneurial mindset that I wanted to sort of highlight that I'm interested in. The first is self-efficacy beliefs. And there's a guy at Stanford named Albert Bandura. I think he's 94 years old. He still shows up every day. Read everything he's written about self-efficacy. So a person with high self-efficacy, like, believes in themselves and their own ability to achieve the goals they set for themselves, is basically what it is. And like, high self-efficacy is sort of on one end of a spectrum. We think of a spectrum like there's mastery on one end and there's learned helplessness on the other, right? We're all sort of somewhere in that spectrum, and it's domain specific. We can have a mastery orientation in one domain and a helpless orientation in another, but self-efficacy is a really important belief. That's really about, you know, I don't have on the tip of my tongue Albert Bandura's definition, but it's really, you know, they're deeply held beliefs about your ability to hit the goals that you want to set for yourself. Locus of control, right? This is another deeply held belief, and what we see and I should back up, and what we see in entrepreneurs is we tend to see a high degree of self-efficacy, right? We also tend to see an internal locus of control, which is a deeply held, mostly unconscious assumption that I'm in control of my fate, my destiny, right? As opposed to someone who has an external locus of control, which is a deeply held belief, mostly unconscious, that fate or luck or circumstances or powerful others somehow control my fate, right? Again, you know, we're not walking around saying, hi, my name's Gary, I have an external locus of control, right? But you can see it in the behavior, what shows up on the surface. You can kind of glean from the behavior what's going on by observing others. It's more difficult to see in ourselves, right? The fixed growth mindset, right? We tend to see in entrepreneurs and experienced entrepreneurs a growth mindset, which is a deeply held belief that I can learn whatever I need to learn in order to pursue my goals, as opposed to a fixed mindset, which is a deeply held belief that my talent, my intelligence is finite, it's fixed, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? And of course, that's Carol Dweck's work there, which she sort of spun out of Albert Bandura's self-efficacy research. We also see in entrepreneurs, the motivation tends to be intrinsic. They tend to be intrinsically motivated, which means the task itself, the reward, there's more likely to be a purpose-driven motive more so than a profit-driven motive. And that makes an enormous difference in their level of motivation. People who are intrinsically motivated tend to outperform people who are extrinsically motivated. I mean, that's, you can look at the research. Deci and Ryan are kind of the go-to guys there. And then lastly, explanatory style. What you see in experienced entrepreneurs is a high degree of resilience. And we know from the work of Martin Seligman and others that resilience comes from an optimistic explanatory style, right? So what does that mean? You didn't know you had an explanatory style, did you? Well, you do. And it's a general tendency that when you find yourself in uncomfortable or challenging situation or some kind of adverse circumstances, what's the story that you tell yourself, right? And that makes an enormous difference on your ability to develop the resilience required, right? So those are sort of the 5 areas of the entrepreneurial mindset that we're interested in. I tend to think of these as the mechanisms of human agency, right? So at the center here, you see like this assumption, it's up to me to figure out how to become useful. Now, here's the punchline. What happens when you see a successful entrepreneur, they tend to have a high degree of self-efficacy. They have an internal locus of control. They have a growth mindset. They're intrinsically motivated and they're optimistic, right? And so then we leap to these conclusions that those are the things that we need in order to be a successful entrepreneur. And that is the fundamental attribution error. What we fail to recognize is that those things are the outcome. They're more so of an effect rather than the cause of the behavior. And believe me, I've been interviewing hundreds of entrepreneurs all over the world. They start out not having a clue what they're doing. They're not necessarily brimming with confidence. You know, they don't know that they have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. They develop, let me just give you an example. They develop an internal locus of control because they're stepping outside of the confines of a known path that's guided by others. They have a growth mindset because they're constantly forced to figure things out without the guidance of others, right? So they start to develop this, right? They keep getting themselves into jackpots and they keep getting out of them, which is why they develop resilience, this optimistic explanatory style. My point is, these are the outcomes more so than the cause. Now, I can't say that with 100% accuracy because, of course, you got to have some modicum of self-efficacy to get started. You got to have some belief that you can make something happen. But the point is that you develop those things in the journey, which kind of brings me to the last point about mindset. And so I made this diagram. This is getting back to the engagement in the development of human potential that I mentioned at the beginning. Some of you are familiar with Peter Senge's work in the fifth discipline. Others, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's work in flow. And I kind of took these two ideas and mashed them together. This is mostly flow stuff, right? So here we are. That's our current reality, right? And there's the compelling goal. That is the linchpin to entrepreneurial behavior. The linchpin is the intersection of your own interests, abilities, and the needs of others. That's what makes the goal so compelling, right? So, what am I trying to say here? If you want to understand why entrepreneurs are so optimistic, resilient, resourceful, creative, critical thinkers, you know, whatever, stop looking at their individual personality profiles and look at the nature of the goal they're pursuing and their relationship to that goal, and you'll understand the behavior, how to elicit the behavior, more importantly. So that's what keeps us in this state of what Csikszentmihalyi calls optimal engagement. It's also known as flow, right? The goal is so compelling that we're constantly being challenged above our skill level. The challenge exceeds the skill level. But because the goal is compelling, we are constantly figuring it out, right? That's what keeps us in that state of optimal engagement. What happens when the goal is not compelling? We become bored and disengaged, right? Now, look at the data here. At least two-thirds of students and at least two-thirds of workers in the United States are not engaged in their learning or their work, right? It's the compelling goal that makes it all happen. I don't have time to get into this whole thing here. I'm going to draw from a quote from Jaime Casap, who's a chief evangelist, education evangelist at Google. He said, stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what they need to learn in order to solve those problems. So That's really the trick, is to find the compelling goal. So I'm going to pause again here, Nick, for questions, comments, suggestions, and then we'll move on to the last part.
One question, I'm going to skip a couple folks ahead just because one of our longstanding friends and facilitators of the Icehouse program, Willie Hill, is on, and he has a question, but he needs to get off soon, so I wanted to get to him first.
Sure.
What is the best way to help new or younger entrepreneurs explore usefulness, especially in the context of our current world with COVID-19?
Try to find relatable social examples. Try to find and expose them to examples of other people who are figuring it out, but socially relatable models. And Willie, you've heard me rail about this, ad nauseum. Like, that's the key. If we can see other people succeeding in this domain, we drastically increase the likelihood that they'll engage in this behavior.
Great, perfect. Okay, Julie Terry asked us, have we heard of the technique of giving the critical voices in our head, the bad thoughts, personas, and confronting, arguing with them to overcome what is holding us back? Kind of a technique of a self-reflection. And then instead of letting those negative thoughts circle in our mind, naming them and confronting how you're going to achieve despite what it's saying.
Yeah, I have heard of those techniques. I've heard them called different things, but it's a super powerful technique. But the point that the question draws out is, like, most of us don't even know that we have that negative talk. It's just happening. It's so repetitious. It's so familiar to us that we don't even recognize it. And so there's a tool I want to mention right now. There's a tool. You can Google search this. If you look up Martin Seligman, like ABC model, and it's a specific tool to help people dispute irrationally pessimistic beliefs. It's Martin Seligman, ABC, just like ABCs, the ABC model. It's a very powerful tool. If anyone on this webinar wants to do a deeper dive in this, probably the best $7 I've ever spent is a book called Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman. I think it's available on audio and Audible and printed. I got it on Audible. Phenomenal book that really delves deeply into that.
Absolutely second that suggestion as well. Just three more quick ones. One is a comment from Michael Shields, a facilitator of the Icehouse program in Ireland, who's talking about, yes, he's talking about how he's customizing his use of the program with finding, to your point earlier about relatable social models, entrepreneurs from his area. So we have a program that includes video case studies of entrepreneurs, and Michael is supplementing that with case studies of his own, thus reinforcing the concept, this is me quoting Michael's comment, of entrepreneurship, which is being taught in colleges and campuses. Really great comment, Michael, and I'm really glad to see that you're finding a way to make this your own. That, combined with your use of technology and increased use of technology, is so paramount to teaching these concepts, not just in the state of the world today, but moving forward.
And on top of that, Nick and Michael, congratulations. And I think what you're finding, Michael, is that, like, these underdog entrepreneurs are everywhere. Like, once you start to look, they're amongst us. They're everywhere. We just ignore them. We get starstruck with the Mark Zuckerbergs or the Elon Musks of this world. We don't realize that there are these positive deviants living among us everywhere that have so much to teach us.
Absolutely. Quick reframing of what we're doing. Would it be correct to say that being entrepreneurial is to discover how to be useful to others? Absolutely. Just reaffirming that is the central thesis of the entrepreneurial mindset. Absolutely.
If you don't get anything else from this webinar, like, that's the takeaway right there.
Absolutely. And then another kind of nuanced question about those who may have already adapted kind of the 5 constructs of the mindset, moving from a fixed to a growth mindset, things of that nature. But now they're finding barriers to entry. Any quick comments on that, Gary, before we move on?
You know, I'll say one thing broad in general that I interviewed an entrepreneur about 10 years ago. His name just went out of my head. I'll think of it in a second. He was part of a Harvard case study, John Osher. And this guy was like a serial inventor. He invented all these consumer products. So he was most famous for the $5 spinning toothbrush, the Crest $5 toothbrush. And he said to me on this interview, which you can find this, if you look up John Osher Eli, you'll find this little clip in which he said this in the interview. He said, I could answer any question you could ask me about entrepreneurship with the same 3 words: find a way. And I think that's really, and he said, which I'm echoing, it's not that useful, but it really kind of speaks to the ethos, to the attitude. Like, how can I get my product in Walmart? How can I find my first customer? You find a way. I mean, and surround yourself with other entrepreneurs, right? That's another super important part here, is to create like an entrepreneurial support network of people who have been through what you're going through.
Absolutely. And I think some of the processes of entrepreneurial learning that you're about to hit on can help show how you can take micro steps towards showing someone who already has adopted all of these constructs how to start to implement too.
Yep. We're done with questions, Nick?
Yeah, if I've missed anyone, don't worry. I'll get to you at the end, and we'll get everyone's questions answered. Okay.
I'm going to hit the third point here, which is entrepreneurial learning, and you know what I've observed in interviewing entrepreneurs and studying entrepreneurs is that they're actively learning, relearning, unlearning. They're constant learners, right? And the trick here is, you know, I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of learning. It's formal learning, it's non-formal, and it's informal, right? And you know, the OECD has published numerous pieces urging educators to begin to shift their focus or to include non-formal and informal learning as well as formal. What we see in entrepreneurs is more of a non-formal or informal, and the distinction is as follows. So non-formal learning, like formal learning is like in a structure, a curriculum, you know, it's formalized as a teacher, you know, a professional teacher, and so on and so forth. Non-formal learning might be a class you're taking outside of school, just, you know, whatever. You're taking a pottery class at some neighborhood, you know, nonprofit or whatever. It's still, you're still desirous to learn, but it's not part of a broader curriculum. Informal learning happens through experience, and you may or may not even know that you're learning. And that's really an important distinction. So I also want to start this part paraphrasing a line I borrowed from the evolutionary psychologist Peter Gray in his book, Free to Learn, in which he said that humans, like every other mammal, are equipped with both the desire and the ability to learn everything they need to learn in order to thrive in their environment, right? We're no different than any other mammal. And I think, you know, that needs to be sort of I think sort of the baseline for a conversation about entrepreneurial learning, right? And in my domain of you know, the observation and analysis of these underdog entrepreneurs, evidence of this is abundantly clear. I could sit here for the rest of the week and tell you story after story after story about people of modest intelligence teaching themselves all kinds of complicated things on their own without formal, guidance or the reliance on a formal learning program. So just want to kind of start there. Now, to translate what we see in entrepreneurs into sort of more academic terms, what we tend to see is experiential learning, it's project-based learning, it's peer-to-peer learning, and it's self-directed learning. Now, I never, ever met an entrepreneur that said, well, yes, what I'm engaging is an experiential problem-based learning. Like, they have no idea what they're doing follows any prescribed or acknowledged academic method. I would just call it natural learning, right? This is how we learn as hunter-gatherers in the wild. So experiential learning, I mean, this is David Kolb's model. He's an education theorist. He's here in Cleveland at Case. This is what entrepreneurs do. They have some kind of an experience. They reflect on the experience. I tripped into a problem, a frustration, or an unmet need. I start thinking about some way to make it better. I experiment. I learn from the experiment, and I keep doing that. And this is sort of an iterative experimental process. That's sort of the micro experimentation I referred to earlier. It's project-based learning. In academic terms, it's student-centered, which means the student gets to determine the problem they're going to solve. That's really, really important. That's where the motivation comes from. It's not externally imposed. The learning occurs in small groups. The teacher isn't the subject matter expert, rather a facilitator. The problem is introduced early in the learning process. It's the problem solving that stimulates the problem solving skills and the acquisition of new knowledge. It's that simple. Here's the linchpin. It's the ill-structured nature of the problem they're solving, right? You just can't go to a library, pull a book off the shelf and say, there's the answer, right? There's no clear right answer. It's open-ended and complex. It's real world. Requires collaboration. It's constantly evolving with new feedback. It's controversy, interest, and it engages more questions. This is really, the cognitive psychologist, what's his name? Gary Klein talks about this, right? We're really good at learning how to function in broad daylight, where the path is clear and the rules are well defined, right? We're really good at that in stability, in well-ordered circumstances. But what we're not good at and what we need in the new world, what every student needs, is the ability to function in the shadows, to be able to function in circumstances that are highly ambiguous. The path is not clear and the rules are not well defined. That's what entrepreneurs do best. And that comes from solving ill-structured problems. I mentioned earlier we use this canvas, Joe, and I'm happy to send this to you if you're interested. It kind of breaks entrepreneurship down into 3 parts. It starts with problem finding. These are questions about the problem. Then it starts with experimentation. Once you understand the problem, then and only then do you start in phase 2 in experimenting and adapting. And once you have evidence of usefulness, then you learn how to advocate for your idea and have people implement it. We call this the Icehouse Opportunity Discovery Canvas. Talk more about it later if you like. We also see, but last thing I want to say is this is really a tool just to guide students through experiential problem-based learning through the ambiguity. We also see what entrepreneurs are doing is called peer-to-peer learning, right? And the research here is quite clear. There's a guy named Eric Mazur at Harvard that's sort of leading the charge in this research. And in the way that peer-to-peer learning increases knowledge retention and student perseverance, their ability their drop rate reduces significantly when the learning is peer-to-peer learning. And then lastly, self-directed learning. And this is based on Gerald Groh's work. How we could talk more about this. But the Icehouse program is kind of designed around like how to move a student from a dependent learner to an interested learner to involved and ultimately to a self-directed learner. For those of you in higher ed know that, many of the students you encounter are totally dependent learners. Their whole academic lives, they've been told what to learn, where to learn, how to learn it, where the answers are. And when you start asking them to solve problems that you don't even know what the problem is, let alone where the answers are, they initially get a little bit challenged with that. And then lastly, I already emphasized this a little bit, but the exposure to the socially relatable models is the key. It is to constantly exposing the students to people that they can relate to, that are succeeding in this domain. And these are some examples from the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. One example here is this guy on the right is Brian Scudamore. He's the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK that he started, as an 18-year-old kid with $1,000, knocking on doors and offering to clean people's, garages and driveways and backyards and whatnot. So he's one of the feature entrepreneurs that we interviewed for the course. But there's a pretty broad variety of entrepreneurs here, all manner of backgrounds, interests, and abilities, and so forth. So I'm going to kind of wrap up now, talk a little bit about the Icehouse program. Most of you are familiar with, I think, from gleaning what Nick has said, some of the folks are on the call. For those of you who aren't, I co-authored this book in 2010 with one of the entrepreneurs that I met along the way, the Pulitzer nominee, Clifton Talbert, who attributed his entrepreneurial journey to his Uncle Cleve as he came of age in the Mississippi Delta in the 1950s as an African-American, born to a teenage mom in his poor cotton community. And he went to work with his Uncle Cleve at the local Icehouse. And he attributed his entrepreneurial success to his Uncle Cleve, who had a 4th grade education. His pants were threadbare. He had an old beat up truck, but he was the only one in his community had money in the bank. And Clifton said it was, working alongside him and these concepts that he learned from his uncle. We gleaned 8 core concepts from hundreds of interviews with these underdog entrepreneurs. We used Clifton's story to tell as the way to kind of tease out those core concepts. That became the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. We got our initial investment funding from the Kauffman Foundation. The Icehouse programs are being used all over the world in ways that I could never have imagined when we got started. Now, middle school, high school, community colleges, 4-year universities, economic development, veterans, small business, reentry, workforce development, learning and development in large corporations, nonprofit organizations. It's amazing how this project has taken off. Tom Rue, who's the former VP of entrepreneurship at Kauffman, now at the NC Idea Foundation in North Carolina, said that the Icehouse program was redefining entrepreneurship in classrooms and communities around the world. That's kind of a proud papa moment for us that was recognized to that extent. So we recently released sort of a version of the Icehouse program that anyone can take. It's on our website. We took the price down to $99 for the COVID, kind of just try to give people a break. A lot of people need to learn how to think this way. So that's available if you're interested. It's on our website. You can take that course. If you want to learn how to become a facilitator of the Icehouse programs, we have our next training is happening in July. That's filling up very quickly. So if you that last one sold out. So just saying there. In about 2 weeks, on the 27th, which is 2 weeks from yesterday, we're going to host a webinar specifically about the Icehouse Entrepreneurship Program. If you're interested, in the deeper dive in the program itself, you can go to that webinar. You can also find a ton of information on our website. So those are 3 ways or 4 ways you can engage with us. You can buy the book, you can go to our webinar, you can become a facilitator, you can take the course yourself. So with all that, I'm going to, there's more information on our website. I want to stop talking now. We still have some time for Q&A.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got 2 good questions. I'll start with the second one that came in because it's closer related to what you were just talking about. Tracy Hayes, who facilitates with Willie down in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Hi, Tracy.
Yeah, hi, Tracy. Asked, how do you construct the driving questions or construct a vision that helps you write a compelling goal? Which I think is a great question in terms of both an assignment you can give folks that are in a class about entrepreneurship, but also something you may want to do for yourself.
It's a really good question. And I think, there's 2 ways to think about this. Like one thing I've done in the past is like ask people to just start thinking about if they had a magic pen and a magic piece of paper, like start journaling about what kind of life do you want to create for yourself, right? If money weren't an obstacle, time weren't an obstacle, COVID weren't an obstacle, I know that sounds a little bit crazy right now, but like, what is it that's compelling to you? What's the life you want to create? Like, just start to journal that, right? Now, a lot of us have come up in ways that we've never dared to dream, right? So, or the dreams might not be big. We can't even see beyond our immediate circumstances. And so, I'm thinking back on my own entrepreneurial journey. Like I started out like survival, right? In my 20s, just like pure survival. As I got more and more success, the scope of my vision grew. And so, I think the way to think about this is, I'm sorry for the technical term, it's the zone of proximal development. You want to be able to have someone like reach just beyond their reach. It can't be so far out of reach because then you'll give up, right? And Bandura talks about this. But it can't be super easy. I would also say to the question, like, look up the concept of guided mastery, because that's really what you're trying to do, is move the needle towards a more mastery away from helplessness. But help people set goals that are just out of reach, not too far out of reach, not too easy. It's like the Goldilocks, just on the edge.
Good question, or good response, Gary, I should say. A 2-part question from Bill in North Carolina. Where does the heart play into the entrepreneurial mindset? And when people think of entrepreneurship, they think of creating a business. What are your thoughts about creating side gigs, side hustles, as opposed to starting over with a new main gig?
Yeah, it's a really, really both super important questions. I'm going to answer them in the order they were asked. With regard to the heart, let's go back to my Venn diagram. What are you naturally interested in? Meaning, what would you do if you didn't need money? Like, what do you do? What are your interests? And I don't mean like, it's not necessarily sports, although, for some people it might be, but, our interests are unique to us. Like, we don't get to pick what we're interested in, right? They kind of come on the hard drive. So that's where the heart comes from. When you find you can only get to the most potent form of human motivation when you're doing something that benefits others, right? That's why I developed that Venn diagram. Your interest, your abilities, and the needs of other people. The intersection of those 3 spheres is the heart. Now, your second question about side hustles. I'm all about the side hustle. I am forever telling people, no. Do not quit your day job, right? When I lecture to students at universities, one of the challenges I give to students is set a goal for yourself to earn $10,000 in a side hustle in your spare time, right? And here's the thing, make sure you put that $10,000 in a separate bank account so you don't touch it, right? When you have $10,000 in a separate bank account that you have generated through your own means, on your own, that will change your life. That will change your sense of self-efficacy, that will change your belief in your abilities, that will give you so much more respect for your discretionary time, your discretionary money, your discretionary thought. You won't waste as much time in your life anymore. You're less likely to get caught up in, just squandering away your time, frittering away your time in social media or whatever. It's a really, really good question. Do not quit your day job. Any other questions, Nick?
Just a couple folks saying thank you for the really informative presentation. If anyone does have any other questions, feel free to enter those either in the chat or the Q&A. If I missed your question, feel free to copy and paste that back in and reframe that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that comment, because when Nick and I designed this webinar today, we wanted to create something that, if we never hear from you again, we never talk to you again, that you got something from this webinar that you could take away that you can use in your life, right? That's what we wanted to help them. There's so many people right now, their lives are turned upside down. They need to learn how to develop entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. We want to just sort of take away all the mystery, strip away the complexity. It's up to us to figure out how to make ourselves more useful to more people. And you don't need a new degree to do that. You don't need lots of venture capital. You don't even need money to do that. You don't need a genius IQ. You don't need to be creative. You just need to learn to start paying attention to what other people need rather than what you need. And it's sort of counterintuitive. And I think that's the simple secret that's in the Icehouse book. That's what Uncle Cleve figured out. Everybody needs ice. The white folks, the black folks, the Chinese folks, the Jewish folks, everybody needs ice, right? And that's really the essence of entrepreneurship. The world is full of opportunities. The challenge is we've just not been trained to recognize them, right? We've been trained to think narrowly, to focus on a job description. We've been trained to think that somebody else needs to tell us what to do and they'll pay us to do it. It never occurs to us, stop thinking about what you need for a minute and start thinking, look around you and think, what do your neighbors need? What's missing? What's broken? What can be fixed? How could I improve something in some small way? That's the genesis right there. It's a muscle. You're not going to walk out of the gate, step outside and hit one over the park. But you
Absolutely.
it's a mental sort of a calisthenic that you're always trying to experiment in your mind. How could we make this better? What if we did it this way? What if we did that?
Absolutely. Quick couple more questions. Josh is asking us, do we have a list of recommendations of books and people we've talked to about in the call?
Yeah.
Absolutely, Josh. We do on our website, elimindset.com. You'll see a tab along the top called resources. And under that, we've got case studies and resource references that we've talked about. We try to keep that fairly up to date. If there's anything that isn't on there that you remember we've missed or you've heard us mention, feel free to shoot me an email back. I'll be sending the follow-up email sometime later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, which will include a recording of this presentation as well as a PDF of the slides to answer your second question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for the question. And we do try to keep that up to date, although there's probably 3 or 4 books I could add on there. But there's plenty to get you started, trust me.
Absolutely. Couple more, so I want to get these lightning round answered. Where an individual's creativity results in a solution to a problem, but the product is not affordable, doesn't make them less entrepreneurial. So if your problem is too expensive or too hard to access, does that make you not necessarily entrepreneurial? I think that's a interesting.
No, I just think that it's a very interesting nuanced question, but it's like, you know, nobody walks out the front door and gets it right on the first try, right? I mean, it's not a matter of are they entrepreneurial? You have to. This is what's so. This is the challenge we have with educators, right? That education has set up this system where we avoid failure at all costs. Yet to be innovative and entrepreneurial, it demands failure, right? So the product's too expensive. Well, then you don't have a solution. Because if nobody can buy it, it's not really a solution. So you kind of got to go back to the drawing board and think about how can we do this differently? And maybe you can't make it cheaper. Maybe it's only, you know, there's a number of different ways to skin the cat, but it's definitely entrepreneurial.
Absolutely. Quick question from Mary Jane. How can you teach entrepreneurial thinking in elementary grades or as low as kindergarten? A quick answer there is the book, Who Owns the Icehouse, has been rated at a 5th grade reading level. So that makes it pretty accessible for younger learners or folks who may be a little behind in their reading in middle or high school. But Gary, if you've got other points there in terms of teaching entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking at younger ages.
So, you know, the trick is to kind of engage. I read this fantastic blog post a couple of days ago from Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, about how he teaches his kids. And he recognizes that school's going to go broad and narrow, right? At least K-12 is. And when you, like, what we want is for like younger people, when you notice an interest, a natural interest, encourage them to go deep in that interest. And I remember a story, I'll be very brief here. I was, you know, on a flight somewhere, and a guy next to me was an executive from IKEA, and I told him I was in the entrepreneurship education realm, and he explained to me that he had a 12-year-old kid that was obsessed with video games. And his kids came to him and said, "Dad, I need $400 for the new PlayStation." And his dad said, like, "No way. I'm not giving you $400 for that. If you want that, you have to earn it." And the kid said, "Well, Dad, I'm 12. How am I going to earn $400? Well, his dad then engaged him in that conversation. The kid liked to do woodworking. So they hatched a plan to build birdhouses. They cost $5 to build. They can sell them for $20. Simple birdhouse plan they found online. They went off to Home Depot. They got some lumber and some tools. And the kid started building birdhouses. And he sold birdhouses first to friends and family. Then he went out in the neighborhood. You know, his dad told me, the bottom line was, his dad told me that he blew right past $400, forgot all about Sony PlayStation. Now he's online researching birds and habitats and species to figure out different kinds of birdhouses to make, right? I mean, it's just an example of encouraging students to figure out how to solve problems on their own, problems they care about. But also, I mean, I want to keep going there for another second. I mean, we also have to recognize the extent to which, like, our parenting, like overbearing parenting, is at odds with our, you know, I said earlier, the ambiguity and the resource constraint are the perfect conditions. The third ingredient that I failed to mention was the compelling goal, because you won't tolerate the ambiguity and the resource constraint if the goal is not compelling. But those are the 3 ingredients, right? But if we're constantly telling our children or our students or our workers what to do, when to do, where to do, how to do it, this over-reliance on rules and policies and structure inhibits their development. It inhibits the ability to develop entrepreneurial attitudes and skills.
Absolutely. Joe Mahoney is making a quick comment about Lemonade Day having a lot of great content for young kids, which definitely, Joe, that's something a lot of folks who use our program, they use Lemonade Day content to kind of supplement as well. And we've had some partner organizations use that for younger kind of boot camps and summer camps as well.
I will say something about Lemonade Day. That's a great way to get kids started. But the criticism I have of those types of methods is that the student or the child is not really discovering anything. So it's more like we're teaching you how to run a franchise rather than teaching you how to go out in the world and discover something useful to other humans on your own, right? I mean, it's a nuanced distinction, but it's very, very important. I'm not saying don't do Lemonade Day, but I'm just saying don't lose sight of the fact that this is really about discovery. It's not about teaching you how to run a business.
Absolutely. I think that's important. It's that's just one piece of the puzzle in teaching these skills.
Correct, correct.
But Gary, I think we're...
Yeah, I just want to go, we're just about to the end. But I see this at entrepreneurship education conferences I go to around the world, that like there's a failure to distinguish between entrepreneurship and managerial, right? And so what a lot of people are teaching is managerial skills. They're not entrepreneurial. They're teaching kids how to write business plans. They're teaching them how to do financial forecasts, how to do pitch presentations, you know, how to do financial analysis and all these things that are super important for managing a business that has a known product and a known service and cash flow and customers. But those things are worthless until you have something useful. And so that's the distinction that another way to think about this is that the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to discover an opportunity are distinct from the attitudes, behaviors, and skills required to exploit that opportunity. That's another way of thinking about it. So thanks for letting me rail on about that one, Joe. Any last questions?
Yeah, just a quick, I'm just making sure I've got my head around this one. Your answer about a solution not being affordable was applicable. Students must be taught that being entrepreneurial does not always result in a wonderful business concept. That a solution may be creative, but it must be affordable for them to be considered useful for others. So kind of looking at that overlap of, it could be the perfect solution, but if your cost of producing it are too high, is it really a feasible, sustainable solution? And I use that word sustainable.
Not a perfect solution.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. And again, Nick, to break it down to like the fundamentals again, right? We forget that currency is a way of measuring usefulness. When someone pulls out their wallet and pays for something, they're saying, this thing is useful to me to this extent, right? It's really that simple.
Absolutely. And to reiterate a point you made earlier, failure is an important part of this step. So it might not even be that the solution isn't adequate, but you may be failing in some process of connecting to the market or to those who need the service. So that's an important point too. It's not just the currency side of things.
Well, and it's also like Nick, you reminded me of another point. Like either way, you win. You either fail or you win or you learn. So all that is a data point. Well, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? It's too expensive. Is it too expensive for me? For you? Is it too expensive for everybody? You know, again, I'll say this until I get hoarse. Entrepreneurial education is the most effective way to teach students how to think critically. There's no better method. You have an idea, you build some little prototype, you go out in the world and you find out what reality really is, right? You have a hypothesis, you document your hypothesis, you go out, you talk to people, you try it, you see if it works, it doesn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, you got to figure it out. You can't go to a library, just pull the book off the shelf and find the answer. You're always functioning, fumbling around in the shadows, trying to figure it out. That's the new learning that every student's going to need.
Absolutely. Well, I think that looks like it wraps it up. No one else is typing any last questions. If you have any, feel free to respond to that follow-up email I'll be sending out later today or tomorrow. And you can always reach out to us on our website, elimindset.com.
Yeah. Well, thanks, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity. I hope this is helpful. And feel free to shoot me an email if you have further questions or any comments you might have.